Welcome to the Small Giants Fishbowl. This episode is a chat with Bo Burlingham. Join us as we deviate a little bit of our standard path and instead do an open forum with Bo Burlingham, author of Small Giants and Inc. editor-at-large. Here members ask Bo about small business, his new book, old books, and everything in between. Okay, here we go.
You assign a reporter to go out and find the story that you think is there, and that's their job, is to find that story. And if it's not there, then they don't have a story, but they don't really get the whole picture. And we were writing stories about a lot of companies that really sounded great, but I weren't sure whether they were really great. And a third reason was that I was, and like most business journalists, I was totally ignorant about the numbers of the business. I mean, I knew the difference between a balance sheet and an income statement, but I didn't know much about them. I didn't really know how to read them the way that an entrepreneur would, or at least a sophisticated entrepreneur would. And I didn't think that you could really be, or I could really be, a competent business journalist unless I got educated about it. Now, as it happened, right around that time, well, we had written about the Springfield Remanufacturing, Jack Stack's company, and the great game of business in 1986. And then we hadn't talked to him for a while. And then I got back in touch with him, and there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. We invited him to an Inc. 500 conference, and he really attracted a lot of attention because this whole idea of sharing numbers with your employees was like totally unheard of, and people thought he was totally crazy to be doing it, and yet it was working. And I was fascinated by that, and at that conference, I had lunch with a bunch of other people, including a well-known editor of books at the time named Harriet Rubin. She was sitting between me and Jack, and I was talking to Jack impolitely. I was talking to him and telling him how much I really loved the story, which was really my favorite story that we had run in the 1980s. And I was asking him about the impact. I said we had gotten a big response to it, and I was asking him about the response he'd gotten, and he was telling me about it. And I just said, it's such a great story. And Harriet sort of looked at me and said, well, why don't you write the book about it? Well, I didn't think I could at the time because I had a lot of responsibilities as executive editor, but I talked to George Gendron about it, and he said, and he could see how excited I was about it, and he said, I think you should do this. This is a great opportunity for you. So that's when I became an editor-at-large. I continued to write occasionally features, but I was basically spending a lot of time in Springfield, Missouri, and getting to know not just Jack, but getting to know people throughout the company, its executives. I lived with people who worked at the company, and I was doing my journalist thing. I was looking for where the bodies were buried, and what were the problems with it. Oddly enough, at the same time, I was recruited by the Body Shop, the international cosmetics company, to be on the board of their U.S. company. And I told them, I said, I don't know, why do you want me to be on your board? And they said, well, we think that you could help with some of the problems we're having in the U.S. So I said, well, I'll go and talk to these people and see if, in fact, I have anything to contribute. So I went down to, it was New Jersey at the time, to their headquarters. And what I saw were people who were absolutely overwhelmed by the growth, the rate of growth And it was, the problems they were dealing with were very similar to problems I'd seen people dealing with, Inc. type companies dealing with. And so I said, okay, I'll do that. So basically, for about 5 years there, I was dividing my time between these two companies. Springfield Remanufacturing, which was, it was an engine remanufacturer. I mean, this is like not a glamorous business. It's basically a glorified job shop, and what they do is these old, dirty, rusty, worn out, heavy duty engines come in and they take them apart, literally. Just take all the pieces apart. They look at the pieces. Their employees look at the pieces and they decide, okay, this one we can keep using. This one we can repair. This one we have to replace and bring in a new part. And they had, it's a extremely tough, extremely competitive business. But because they had implemented this great game of business, those people on the shop floor who were deciding, well, how many new pieces should we use and how many pieces should we recycle? And well, we don't want to, if we make bad decisions, our warranty rate is going to go up. There were all these really important decisions that were going to affect the value of that business. And they were able to make those decisions because they understood how the business worked and how the business made money. And, we're talking about people who really, in many cases, they had a high school education. Some didn't even have that. But they were making these very, very critical decisions. And so inside, there were all of these really amazing things that were happening. On the other hand, I was also working with the body shop. Now, the body shop was, at that point, world famous. Nita Roddick was who was the founder, had I don't know, she'd gotten the same medal that the Beatles got, that the Queen gave her. She was a famous person in England, and she was becoming famous in this country. And it was a very glamorous business because they were, they'd really sort of created a splash, so to speak, in the cosmetics industry. And it was a sexy business, and everybody wanted to look at it. I mean, from that point of view, it certainly had in the beginning a lot of mojo. Inside, business was a mess, a total mess. It was closed book. It was being run. The accountants and the lawyers had way too much influence. You could see that things were just, there were a lot of conflicts between them and the franchisees, and they were making a lot of mistakes. And the biggest mistake they were making was to underestimate the competition. So I was dividing my time between these two companies, one of which is totally unglamorous, but inside the company, all of these hugely exciting things were happening. And on the other hand, this very glamorous business inside was a total mess. And it was a fascinating education for me. And after that, I was beginning to, through those things, I was beginning to sort of get a handle on the numbers and learn about the numbers. And then I had the good fortune to meet Norm Brodsky. Norm Brodsky is the founder. Some of you if you've read Small Giants, he's one of the people in Small Giants. He and I also wrote a book together, and we do a column. We've been doing a column for the last 19 years, believe it or not, in Inc. magazine, the monthly column. Norm is he's a brilliant entrepreneur in his own right, and but he's been through some amazing experiences, including some amazingly awful experience. The common story that you may have heard about Norm is that he started a company and he took it from 0 to 120 million in 7 years, and then he took it from 120 million to 0 in about 7 months because of various bad decisions that he made. But Norm was someone he learned a lot from that experience. A lot of good things ultimately came out of it. But it was a very, very hard experience for him. And Norm really became my teacher about the numbers. And I got a really good education in the numbers from Norm. So I regarded the 1990s as really mainly the period in which I was getting my education about business. And I was a much, much better journalist at the end of that decade than I was at the beginning. I wrote 2 books during that decade. Both of them were with Jack Stack. One was The Great Game of Business, which has had it's been a very successful book. The other one, a lot of people think is actually a better book, but not nearly as many people have read it. It's called The Stake and the Outcome. And it's really the narrative of sort of how SRC, tried to develop and succeed in developing what they call a culture of ownership. In the early 2000s, there's a big change at Inc. magazine. The founder died. The company was sold to a big German company called Gruner & Jahr. A whole new editorial team was brought in, and the magazine was moved from Boston to New York. I was one of the people, there weren't a lot of us, who stayed on. And in fact, I started to write a lot more for Inc. after that. And I was a much better journalist. I could actually go into a company and look at their financial records if they had them, and, sort of be able to figure out what was going on. And one of the articles I wrote about, one of the companies I wrote about was Zingerman's. Well, in those, again, you undoubtedly are all familiar with Zingerman's, so I'm not going to go through that story. But, Zingerman's led to Small Giants. The Zingerman's story was the cover story of the Inc. magazine in January 2003. It got a big response, and it led to a book contract for me, namely what became Small Giants. Small Giants came out in 2006, actually the end of 2005, beginning of 2006. And a lot of things happened with it that have absolutely knocked my socks off and blown me away. Made me, I would never have imagined, I never did imagine would happen with that. And that's been really exciting. And subsequent to that, I did a book with Norm Brodsky called The Knack. Now it's available in paperback, and it's called Street Smarts. And it's really, what I did was to take all the columns, and instead of having them be columns, I sort of rejiggered them to make them actually a book. Oddly enough, most people who've read the columns don't realize that when they read the book, which is fine. And, that's done okay. But then I started on a new project because I'd watched Norm sell his company, and we had, in fact, written a series in the magazine about that process where we covered it in real time. I mean, or as real as you can get in a monthly magazine, and it got a huge response. Suddenly I realized, gee, there's a lot of interest in exits, isn't there? So I went to my publisher, and they liked the idea of my doing a book on exits. And so we did a contract, and I started working on it. And the first thing that I realized is that aside from having worked with Norm, I knew nothing about this subject, that we had never really written about it in the magazine. And so what I did was I went out and interviewed, I don't know how many, somewhere between 100, 150, something like that, entrepreneurs who, most of whom had actually gone through the exit process. And what I found was about half of them were happy about the way it had all turned out. About half of them were absolutely miserable. They wished they were at a point where they were lost. They didn't know what they were doing. They wish they'd never sold their companies, et cetera, et cetera. And so I said, well, okay, here's the book I'm going to write. What's the difference between those who are happy at the end and those who aren't? And that's what Finish Big is about. And Finish Big will be coming out on November 28th, just in time for Christmas. So I trust you will all buy copies for your father-in-law, your mother-in-law, your, somebody you meet at the gym, whoever you can find. But in any event, that's where we are. So that's a long-winded way to. I actually wound up taking up my 15 minutes.
Perfect. We can work with that.
Okay.
And so, two things here. I'll go ahead and get the questions started off. Right now, unfortunately, our chat function isn't working. So if you have a question, just do me a favor. Raise your hand, and I'll get you in the queue. And when we move on, I'll go ahead and direct traffic and get to folks' questions. So,
what do the people who are on the phone do?
Well, that was going to be the second part. I'm going to ask for 30 seconds from each person to you got to follow my lead, though.
Okay.
Ask for 30 seconds from each person that's on in order to give us an idea of the background and depth of the conversation we're about to have. So we'll start with Sue Funkhauser. Go ahead, Sue.
Hi. So I have a burning question from a colleague that I'm working with, a client.
Real quick, Sue.
What?
I'll give you the first question. Can you go ahead and just give me a 20, 30-second bio on you right now so that we can know who's in the room?
All right. I'm an organizational development consultant. I work with companies primarily around their culture and employee engagement.
Great.
Based in Los Angeles. Okay, can I ask my question?
Yeah.
We're going to get everybody, and then you're my number one question, I promise.
Sorry.
Oh, we're going to go around first? Okay.
Todd, go ahead.
I'm Todd Welch. I'm in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. I help companies form their own little mutual insurance company. It's multiple companies, not just one. So it's collaborative insurance, for lack of a better term. And love being here. It's knew Bo a while ago and been following his work, and it's an honor to be here with you and with Bo again.
Great. Thanks, Todd. Keith?
Keith Squires. We're out of Dallas. The company name is Pathmaker Group. And about 11 years ago, I started a company of employees. Prior to that, had done a lot of work with contractors, and we're in the IT consulting business. This company focuses on security, something called identity management. And so we've been at this about 11 years. We built a pretty strong culture, strong group of leaders, and right now we're in the process of trying to build a solid platform to kind of springboard into further growth. So doing a lot of work to kind of build out the infrastructure and leadership necessary for that.
Great. Thank you.
Glad to have you, Keith.
Thanks, Paul.
To our mystery guest on the phone, Mary Beth.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Brown. I'm in San Diego, California. I work with my husband at Advanced Practice Advisors. We're an RIA, have been in business for 5 years. We think we want to be a little bigger. We are a boutique. I read Small Giants, and I became intrigued with this trend, so here I am.
Great.
Glad to have you.
Chris, go ahead. You're currently on mute.
There we go. I'm Chris Manley with a company called Ingenious. We're based out in South Carolina, and we're a 10-person web marketing firm serving mostly small businesses. We're a small giant that didn't know it. Sorry.
Didn't know it.
My wife's
There are
name
a lot of you out there,
right now.
Yeah.
we're a small giant that didn't realize that we were a small giant. I read the book over the summer, finally picked it up off my shelf, and realized that the core values of a lot of these companies are the same things that we've been trying to achieve for almost 7 years now. So kind of aligned with it really closely, and Glenn's done a great job of getting us involved.
That's really. I think that's why the book has frankly been successful. Is that a lot of people read it and they recognize themselves in it. They're already there. They just didn't have a name for what they were.
Yeah, and just for reference, in early 2015, Chris is going to be leading a fishbowl on community building inside of your company.
Oh, great.
So I'm excited for that. And lots of other fishbowls coming up, but we'll get to that at the end. Aaron, go ahead.
Me, Aaron. I am Aaron Walter, and I'm with New Fork, which is I'd say we're a small marketing company out of Chicago.
Great. Thanks, Aaron. And then Bill.
That's all, Aaron? Come on.
Well, I mean, I guess there's more, but that's essentially it. We're a sister company of Tasty Catering, which is also a small giant.
Yes. Good to see you.
Hey, Bo.
And then Bill, go ahead.
Whoa.
I am Bill Kirschbaum. I'm the content specialist at an inbound marketing company called the Whole Brain Group. And we are a small company of about 12.
Great. Bill, I think I'm going to be seeing more of you.
Yes, you will. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
All right. Everyone, thank you for the background information. Sue, go ahead.
Sorry, I was a little eager. Okay, so I have a client who has his own company, 50 employees, privately owned, in the fundraising range, going to bankers, more funding, etc. He and his partners are really struggling because they ultimately want to sell. That's absolutely their goal, is to sell, and it's really emerging technology that they've done that's pretty amazing. But they're also like, well, we want to sell, but we don't quite have people who want to buy us yet, but we wonder if we don't sell right away and we go long haul. So he's really struggling with, how do you simultaneously manage your company when you might sell it if someone comes around tomorrow, or you might have to be around for a while and do a long haul. So he's struggling with, how do I manage the do I need to manage the company differently, given the two different strategies of exiting, right? And if I do, how do I have to? So I'm curious about what folks.
All right. Well, first place, I don't consider myself an exit. I would never manage somebody's exit. What my book is, I really talk to lots of people, and I do explain, I think, certain things that you need to understand. First thing is that you need to understand that the exit is not an event. It's a phase of the business. You have a start phase, you have a growth phase, there's an exit phase. And second thing is that there are really 4 stages to it. The first is really educational or exploratory, as I put it in the book, where you basically start to answer some basic questions about what you want. Do you want a company, for example, that goes on after you? Do you want your company to last after you? Do you want a company, do you want to, in fact, basically sell it? Do you not care about having it go on after you? In which case, you probably want to sell it for as much money as you can get, so that you can then go on and do something else. And it's very important to answer those questions first. The problem that too many people get into is I should say the second stage is the strategic phase. And that's when you actually build into the company the qualities that are going to make it attractive to people or companies that you've identified, if you're planning to sell it, companies that you've identified that, maybe you're going for private capital, I don't know what it is, but you want to build into the company certain qualities. I mean, it's different if you're going to sell to your employees or if you're going to keep it in the family. I mean, but there's some similarities between it. But the question, that's the second phase. The third phase is when you actually do the sale. In other words, you actually go out and you start looking for buyers, and then you go through, and that ends with the deal. But the deal is not the end of the exit. The fourth phase is the transition phase, and that's when, it comes after the exit, and it's when you go through the period and you transition to something new, and you're fully engaged in whatever that new thing is. You are not done with your exit until you've moved on like that. Now, the exploratory phase you do on your own. You read my book, for example, or you go around and you talk to people you know. You investigate companies that are, you read. I mean, I'm going to have on my website lists of books and people like that you can go talk to. That's all you can do yourself. Once you get into the strategic phase, where you're actually moving toward the execution phase, you need help. And basically, you need people who can come in and advise you about how to build the kind of value that is going to allow you to achieve the kind of exit you want. And there are people who do it, who do that. There are a lot of good. There's a resource that I would recommend. I write about it in the book. It's called the Sellability Score. It's a friend of mine, John Warlow, who's an entrepreneur himself and has built and sold several companies. He wrote a book called Built to Sell, which is sort of one of those. There you go, Built to Sell. It's sort of a it's one of those fables, one of the business fables with a lot of good lessons in it about how you take a service business and put in the kind of qualities in that service business that will allow you to sell it at some point in the future. After he wrote Built to Sell, he put up a website, and on this website he had a little, just to sort of get people involved, something they could go to called the sellability something or other, and he found that there were lots and lots of people going to it, more than he expected. And as he looked into it, he said, there's a business here. And he invented the Sellability Score. What the Sellability Score will do is you go to it, it's free. You don't have to pay anything for it. He makes his money in another way. You fill out a questionnaire. They have an algorithm that's based on a very sophisticated set of criteria that they've developed over a period of time, and you get back a report. The report is the valuable thing to you because it goes through 8 different factors that are going to affect whether or not you have how attractive your business is likely to be. And it's extremely educational to look at that and to see what those factors are and to see how you stack up in terms of those factors. There are also other people out there. I write in my book something that I believe that when you do go for advice, particularly when you go for advice about how to prepare a company for exit and then how to execute, you need a guide. But there are a lot of guides. The real trick is to hire the right kind of guide. There are a lot of people out there, brokers, investment bankers, so forth, who will tell you, well, we can do this for you, you know. I strongly recommend that whoever you get as a guide be somebody who has been through the process, him or herself. In other words, there are people who've done it and made a lot of mistakes while they're doing it. But they look at the whole process differently because they've been entrepreneurs themselves. They look at it differently from these sort of professional M&A people. You'll need them later on. They will have a role to play, or they may have a role to play. But they are not the people, you know, they look at it from a perspective, they want the deal done. They don't really get paid until they get the deal done. And as far as they're concerned, everything's over once the deal's done. They get their money and move on to another client. As far as the entrepreneur understands that the deal is just the climax of the whole thing. There's a whole other phase, which is what happens afterwards. And you need somebody. Now, again, I'm going to have some recommendations. I can give you some recommendations depending on how far along they are in the process. Here's another resource I'll recommend. A guy named Basil Peters he's in Basil, Basil Peters. He's in Vancouver. He's got something called the Strategic Exits. It's a company called Strategic Exits Incorporated. He's written a book. He's written actually two books. One is a regular book. Hold on, I've got it here. This. It's called Early Exits. Why is it backwards? Okay. It's called Early Exits, and you can get it off of his website. It's very interesting. It's mainly for technology companies and a particular type of technology companies. But he is very, very knowledgeable about this. He went through he sold his own company. And it's an amazing story, which I tell in the book, because he made literally every mistake in the book when he was doing it. And that was his education. But, you know, he's also somebody, Strategic Exits, his company does do this. And, you know, so I guess the point that I would make is, there are two things here. The first stage with your clients, Sue, is they've got to decide who they are, what they want, and why. Generally speaking,
They have.
Okay, well, when you wait around thinking maybe somebody will come along and buy this business, you think that will be a good thing. That's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. The reason it's a bad thing, it's everybody's sort of idea, well, gee, somebody will come along and buy this business. It's a bad thing because, number one, you are going to be dealing with one buyer, and you should always be dealing with multiple buyers if you can. Number two, you know, it's nice to be approached by a potential buyer. And I would urge people to, if that happens, to talk to these people and learn as much as you can from them. Sometimes you even take the process along a little bit, and the more you do, the more you learn. So it's good in the sense of being potentially an educational experience. But when you actually decide you want to sell the business, there are a lot of different factors that come into play, and you need to, you need to look at those. Timing is a huge one. So you need actually a guide who's going to help you figure that all out.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Todd, go ahead.
Bo, I went through this we sold a business about 10 years ago to a large company, and made a lot of mistakes. We did a lot of things right. It's accidentally,
that happens.
but we also made a lot of mistakes along the way. And one of them, what I realized, was just how hard it was emotionally, because our culture was such that the people were like family. So there was this transition of.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, that company was sold in 2000. And next Friday night, we're having an event where 65 of the 100 employees are coming back for a reunion. I mean, that's the culture we've had, right? But
They aren't still there.
no, they're all over. Some of them did very well. Some of them were miserable. I mean, some of them just really had a hard time with the transition. Some of them really did well. They loved it. So it was a mixed bag. But it was hard on me selling the company. We'd made quite a bit of money, and some people were not happy. And so it was really kind of a mixed bag. The experience was kind of a mixed bag.
There are a lot of stories like that.
Yeah.
I probably should have interviewed you, Todd, because what you're telling me, actually, I've heard from every story is a little bit different, but there are certain patterns. And so go ahead.
Right. So I had that experience. Then we built another company of equal size the next 10 years. And then kind of like Norm, it went from being a really big company to a really small company. Made some more mistakes, but now we're kind of building I think we're back on the rise again. It took us a few years, and I want to design it. I feel like this time I really want to build. I've learned a lot, on the trust tour we learned a lot too, but I want to build a company that's sustainable for the long run. I don't want to sell it again. I don't want to go through that, but I also want to. But I want to make some money on the way out too, So during the process, I'm trying to build a company that can have like an ESOP in it that can transition and go on for a long, have that culture of sustainability and longevity, and build in the next generation right into the company. Have you seen companies that have done that successfully?
Well, let me say this: the only companies I looked very hard for companies that had remained privately owned. In other words, not companies that went public.
Yeah.
And that had built up the kind of a culture you're talking about, a very intimate culture, a sort of a small giants type culture, and a high performance culture, and managed to maintain it, not just through one generation afterwards, but through two. You can find companies that have done it through one generation. Finding ones that have actually been able to sustain it for several generations. The only kind of companies I found that have been able to do that were either family-owned or employee-owned. And the reason why, it's not that all family. Obviously, there are a lot of family-owned businesses that are totally screwed up, and there are employee-owned businesses that go out of business. But if you're looking for a company with longevity, in my experience, and that have stayed private, they have either they're either family-owned businesses or employee-owned businesses. And my theory is basically the culture needs a protector. And in the family, the family is the protector, and in the employee-owned business, the employees are the protectors. That said, this is like one of the most. I argue that doing what you want to do, Todd, building a great company is not the most difficult thing in business. It's the second most difficult thing in business. Building a great company that can actually last through, 2, 3, 4 changes in leadership is the most difficult thing. The problem is that the people who have founded companies that have in fact lasted like that are all dead. They're not around anymore. but so I couldn't interview them. I tried, but I couldn't interview them. I did. The person who has thought most about this, and who I feel has given the next generation and the generation after that the greatest shot, is your friend and mine, Jack Stack. And he's actually, he's funny when he talks about it, but basically, in a sense, when you look back, it's something he's been working on since, well, probably for the last 30 years, certainly for the last 25 years. In fact, the great game of business turns out to be one very important part of it, because the tricky part is being able to have a system in place that can last beyond you. So the question is, in other words, when somebody builds a great company, a lot it's a reflection of the owner. And when another owner comes in, companies tend to be private companies tend to be reflections of the people at the top, particularly the owner. And, when another owner comes in, he or she brings in their own ideas about how to run a business, which are usually different from the previous person, and everything changes. That's also true if you have people who built great businesses, but it's really their personality, their priorities, their way of doing things that have set things up. The ability of those companies to last beyond the loss of that owner and leader, it can go on for a while, but whether it's going to go on after that, I don't, I'm skeptical. On the other hand, if you have a system that everybody in the company knows and understands and is able to follow, then you've got something that can last. So it's really the building of the system. I would also say something, and this should probably affect, this conversation. My book is targeted at obviously the people who are going to pick up a book called Finish Big, or people who are at some stage of thinking about finishing big, most people. In other words, thinking about exiting. But it's not for people. I think it's a book for people who are just starting companies, or even people who are thinking about starting companies, because it's really about how do you have a great life. And in the same sense that Small Giants is about how do you have a great life. It's about, that's the ultimate idea, right? Is how do you have a great life? Yeah. And, unless you choose to work until they drag you out or take you out on with your boots on, and if you're planning to have a life after the business, it's, you've got to, it's something that if it's going to be a great life, you've got to plan for, and you've got to sort of know what lies ahead. And Todd, when you were talking about your first company that you sold, I'm sure you learned a lot. And obviously one of the conclusions that you drew was that the next time you don't want to go through that again. No. And that's, that's a very valuable lesson to have learned. Extremely valuable. I do have a whole chapter. Basically, the Finish Big, I come up with 8 things that seem to have the biggest effect on whether or not you feel happy afterwards. And I've got a whole chapter in there on doing right by the people who've been on the journey with you.
That's the most critical lesson I learned, is that no matter how much money I made, and we did, everybody was congratulating us about all the money we made, and and so forth. But for me, it was a stomach ache for months about these people. I just was really worried about these people and what happened to them, and I still had it. And when I go on Facebook, it's interesting. When I go on Facebook, which I don't do very often, but for my birthday, you get a lot of messages, which maybe you guys do too. And I can tell you, the most messages I get are from people from my company. That's still. That's what you end up caring about. It's nice to make money, but it's people. It comes down to people. And so thank you so much for your work. And I think how do you have a great life? What's underlying your books, is a beautiful thing. It really is. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't realize it when I was writing them.
Yeah.
But when I look back now, I say that's really what it's all about.
Yep, it is.
Hey, Bo, of those 8 things, I don't want to spoil them all because the book's coming out.
Spoil them all, Glenn. That's all right.
I was going to say, actually, we've got about two minutes here left. Could you give us a minute on 2 things?
Sure.
From the
The first one is, it's actually the same one that's in Small Giants as the first characteristic. It's knowing who you are, what you want, and why. The more, the older I get, the more I think and learn about business, the more I believe that, it's not something, to a certain extent, we all spend our entire lives figuring out who we are, what we want, and why. It's not something that you go away on a weekend and or have a strategic retreat, but it's really, really important. And you find out how important it is. If you haven't thought about it, you find out when you exit, as Todd was talking about. The second thing is that you need to have a sellable business. And the question is, well, what is a sellable business? I talk about that in the book. The main thing is that you don't want to have a business in which at some point something happens and you're forced to exit. And I don't mean just going out of business. There are a ton of things that can happen. The third thing is that you want to get the right kind of help. There's a whole aspect to that's important to understand so that you know exactly what you're looking for. The fourth aspect, I might have these out of order, is that you give yourself enough time. It takes much more time. Whatever you're thinking is the amount of time it takes to get your company ready to sell. I can assure you it's a lot more than that. It's probably like 3 or 4 times as much as whatever you're thinking about. And that's particularly true if, like Todd, you want to have a company that lasts beyond you, because then you need to deal with a whole succession issue, and that's a whole thing in itself. I've got a chapter on that. The next one is what we talked about before with Todd, which is the people part, and that doesn't just include your employees. I mean, obviously your employees are a big part of it, but it also includes people who are your investors. And particularly if you've got a lot of small investors who've sort of come to your aid and who are really sort of personal friends, put their faith in you. The next one is that it's important to understand who we have the expression, let the buyer beware. Well, mine is let the seller beware. Know who is buying you and why they want to buy you. One of the big problems that people get is that, you get a lot of promises beforehand and then things turn out to be really different when you have no power at that point. And then the final one is, has to do with making a transition to whatever comes next. Now, one of the things I will say is, and this is probably one of the more important points in the book, is that what happens when you leave your business is that you discover that you were getting out of it a lot of things you weren't aware of at the time. You get your purpose, your identity. When people ask you, what do? You know how to answer that question. You get structure. Very hard to live without structure. A business gives you structure. You get a tribe, people who you're part of. You get all of these things that are sort of abstract, and you may think of while you're running the business, you're probably not aware of them on a day-to-day basis as you run the business, but you become acutely aware of all of them as soon as you get out. The people who finish big, that is the people who wind up, and I look at some of them, and you'll talk to people who have really done it right. They will tell you they are happier than ever. Sort of like becoming a grandparent. I say to my wife, if we could have done this first, I would have done it first. You have to go through the first stage in order to get to that stage. But what they wind up doing is, because they have money and because they know who they are, what they want and why, and they've done all the other things right, they're able to do on a higher level with more people and with greater impact what they were doing before. The way they go about it may be totally different, is usually totally different. But you talk to those people, and they all say the same thing. I'm having as much fun as I'm allowed to have. Any more fun, if I'm having any more fun, it would be illegal or immoral or something like that. That they just absolutely feel fantastic. I believe that's because, all right, now I'm gonna really go up in the clouds here. When you run a business, whether you know it or not, you're in service. At the very least, you're serving your customers, and you're serving your family. You're probably serving your employees. You're serving your community. I think that's where people get, entrepreneurs in particular, get their sense of purpose from and their identity from. In other words, what are you doing and who are you doing it for, and why are you going to feel good about it? Everybody, I think that is, when people leave their businesses and they're really disoriented, one of the reasons they're disoriented is they don't know who they're serving anymore. And there may be a lot of loose ends. So I don't know. I'm sort of really going up in the clouds here, or
I think it's beautiful. Perfect.
Yeah. And actually, I don't want to stop your trip into the clouds, but we are out of time.
I understand.
So I believe at the summit we established that like a big round of applause.
Well, I applaud you guys. I always think that the most important part of any conversation is who's listening to it and who is contributing. So I really appreciate it.
Okay, well that's it for this one. Check out more Fishbowls exclusively for the Small Giants community at smallgiants.org.